Now, in Numbers chapter 22, they arrive at a place called the Plains of Moab. So in other words, they have gone from Egypt down to Mount Sinai. They were there for 2 years, and then they came up and they began to wander around, and we don't know exactly all where they went, but they wandered around, and finally, after 40 years, they arrived right here, which is known as the Plains of Moab. Now let me stop, as I told you I would do, because sometimes these names we throw out, we need to know where these names came from. The Plains of Moab. Who was Moab? He was a son, that's true. Son of somebody. All right, who was that fella back there who, it's a horrible story. His father's name was Lot. Lot, who became inebriated by his 2 daughters, and they lay with him, and they each had an incestuous, a child. And the 2 children born were Moab and Ammon. And from those 2 came the Moabites that lived here on the east side of the Dead Sea, and the Ammonites that are up here just a little bit further on the east side. And they were perpetual irritants to the Israelites from that day on. So you'll be hearing about them quite a lot. So from Numbers 22 then, through the book of Deuteronomy, it takes place right here at the Plains of Moab. In other words, they're just on the east side of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross over. And the last thing they do is Deuteronomy. Now that sounds like a real sophisticated word, but it's simply 2 Greek words. Deuteros, which means 2 or second. Nomos, which means law. It's the second reading of the law. And if you read the book of Deuteronomy, you see a lot of repetition. The 10 Commandments are there, as they are in the book of Exodus. And a lot of other things too that's repetitious. And here's the point on that. The people who had seen the parting of the Red Sea, the people who had been given the 10 Commandments, what happened to those people?
They all were supposed to die before they could get out of the 40 days.
Most of them, if not all of them, died in the 40 years wandering. So the generation that now is at the Plains of Moab, ready to enter the Promised Land, is a generation that has never really probably pondered the entirety of God's law. So Moses basically says to them, before we enter, I want you to hear God's law. Now for them it was the first time. But in essence, to the Israelites, it was the second giving of the law, thus the book of Deuteronomy. So Numbers 22 through the book of Deuteronomy takes place at the Plains of Moab.
How much time frame goes off at that Plains of Moab?
Not long at all. I don't know exactly, but I mean, we're not talking months. We're probably talking maybe a few weeks at best. Okay, now let's talk about this law thing. You had to really muddle through all these laws. Some of them are non-understandable. Some of them are utterly ridiculous. And there are so many of them. So what I want us to do tonight is to try to come to some understanding of what this Old Testament law is all about. And if it's in the Bible, then it has to be saying something to us, I guess. So how are we as Christians then to deal with the Old Testament law? To answer that question, what I want us to do is turn to Matthew chapter 5. And this is the lens through which I want us to see all of the Old Testament law. The Sermon on the Mount is very closely linked with the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Let me show you something interesting I bet you've never seen. Look at chapter 5, the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Look at verse 1. Now when he, Jesus, saw the crowds, he went up on a what? And sat down. Now, notice some of the things that Jesus says here. Let me show you something. Look at chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard it said to the people long ago, do not murder. All right, let's pause and ask. Where was that said? On Mount Sinai. 10 Commandments. You've heard it said, now what we're dealing with here is what I call a tale of 2 mountains. You've heard it said on this mountain, thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not murder. Okay, but look at verse 22. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Now, we'll have a section where we deal with the Sermon on the Mount, so let's not try to get into the intricacies of that. But look at those words. You've heard it said on Mount Sinai, thou shalt not murder. Well, who said that? God. Jesus said, but I say to you. Now, let me show you another. Look at verse 27. This is the one I had in mind, obviously, a moment ago. You have heard it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, where have we heard that? Mount Sinai. Look at verse 28. But I tell you.